So we're going to be talking about vertical motion. And before we even look at problems, all vertical motion is say you're a basketball player and you have a basketball in your hand and you shoot the basketball to the hoop. It makes a parabola, which is our quadratic equation, and we're looking at potential and all of these when that basketball or when an object hits the ground. Okay, we can still factor, we can still complete the square, we can use a quadratic formula. Second period chose to use a quadratic formula for all these problems, but if you see something that's easier, then that's fine. Now, you will need a calculator because our numbers get relatively large. So let's go through this. These directions will also be on your test, so you will have the equation that you need, and you will also know what each of the variables stand for. So it will just be a matter of filling in the equation and then either using factoring, completing the square, or the quadratic formula. Okay? So our vertical motion equation is h of t equals negative 16t squared plus vt plus c. Do we remember when we talked about function notation and I told you that h of t or f of x or whatever it is the same as y equals? They can be replaced. Okay? Typically we use function notation when we are plugging something in. Okay? In this case, h of t is going to be our approximate height, and this is going to be your ending height. So that might be important to write down. Not only is it the approximate height, but it's going to be your ending height. So where the object ends. In feet. T is time. Okay, how long the object is in the air. And then ultimately when the object hits the ground. V is your velocity, so how fast the object is moving, and C is going to be your initial height. What we're solving for in all of these problems is T. We're finding how long it takes something to hit the ground. Okay? Questions with the direction part. All right. We're going to go through and underline things and figure out what variables they belong to. So the Empire State Building is 1,250 feet tall. If an object is thrown upward from the top of the building at an initial velocity of 38 feet per second, how long will it take the ball to hit the ground? So let's start with this 1250. What do we think, what variable do we think that's going to be?
H.
It's going to be our C because it's our initial height. It's where the ball or the object starts. Okay, this is going to be my C. I'm standing literally on top of a building with something in my hand. Okay, I'm 1,250 feet in the air. I throw the ball with a velocity, so what letter is that going to be? V of 38 feet per second. How long will it take the ball to hit the ground? So I'm looking for time, but I want to know when the ball hits the ground. What height is the ball at if it's on the ground? 0. So my h of t, my ending height, is 0. Because the ball's on the ground. It has no height.
Will that height always be 0?
For all of these problems, the height's always going to be 0. Now, if it says, how long will it take for the ball to hit another building that is 20 feet off the ground? What would be your ending height? 20 feet. Okay, so you just have to kind of read through it. But for most of these, they're going to be 0. All right, so let's plug that information into our equation. So h of t is 0. And then I have negative 16t squared. My v is 38. And my c is 1250. So t stays in your equation. Everything else gets replaced. Are we okay with that? Okay. At this point, we can decide if we're going to factor, if we're going to complete the square, if we're going to use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula really will probably be your best bet because you don't have to worry about changing positives to negatives. You can just use things as is. And because we're looking for time, our answers can be decimals, which means we're using our calculator for everything. That simplifying part that everyone was having trouble with quadratic formula, we don't have to necessarily do. Does that make sense? Okay, it might make more sense when we go through it. So let's do quadratic formula. What would my A term be? Negative 16. B, 38, and C, 1250. Okay, and we're going to plug that information into the quadratic formula. So T equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. Now, these numbers are large, and when you start multiplying them, they're going to get bigger, which is why you have a calculator. Okay, so let's simplify. T equals negative 38 plus or minus 38 squared is 1,444. I would make sure you're plugging things in as I go so that you can make sure you're plugging it in correct. Remember, this 4 is negative, so it's negative 4 times negative 16 times a positive 1250. What'd you get there? 80,000. All over negative 32. Right? Okay, so T equals negative 38 plus or minus, when I add 80,000 and 1444, I get 81,444 all over negative 32, which is where you guys were not having trouble, right? You could get that far. Here's where you started having trouble, determining if this was a perfect square or having to simplify that radical. We don't have to do that. We are literally plugging it into our calculator because it's a word problem. So in your calculator, you know you have two answers, right? So let's do the first one. So it would be negative 38. That's a 5. Let's try that again. There we go. So negative 38. Now we're going to do plus the square root of 81,444. And then I'm going to press equals and then divide by negative 32. I literally just plugged that whole thing into my calculator.
So just press equals?
And then divided by negative 32. You should get negative 7.7. Did you get that? Okay, so that's our first answer. Now let's do it again, but now we have the subtraction sign in between. So it's negative 38 minus the square root of 81,444. I'm going to press equals, divided by negative 32. And you should get 10.1. Okay, so you don't have to worry about simplifying that radical. You're just plugging it into your calculator and we're getting a decimal. And there may be times it will be a whole number, and that's okay. Now let's...
Can you do that without equal problem? Oh yeah, I do.
Can you do it what?
Can you plug in the calculator with all the problems the way you did?
It has to be, unless it's a word problem, you need to simplify it appropriately. Okay? Because this word problem, we can have decimals because we're talking about time. Now, are we okay with both of those answers?
No.
Dalen, why are you not okay with an answer? You cannot have negative time. So this answer is not even a possibility. Because when you're holding the ball on the Empire State Building, the time is 0, right? You haven't done anything. Then you throw it, and with that velocity, it's going to hit the ground after 10.1, what do you think? Seconds, because your velocity is in feet per second. With a velocity that fast, it'll be quick. Okay?
Dude, I can't believe 67 girls are on the prom.
Let's do number 2 together again. But it's going to be the same idea. Again, you can factor, you can choose to do it a different way. Quadratic formula isn't too bad, I don't think, for these problems because you don't have to simplify. Okay, so an object is shot from a cannon at an initial velocity of 20 feet per second. So what's that 20 feet going to be?
C.
What? Your velocity. It's V. It says initial velocity.
I had the word initial.
Okay. The cannon is 6 feet above the ground. That's C. Your starting height is C. How long will it take for the object to hit the ground? So what is H of T? 0, because we want to know when it hits the ground. So take 10 seconds and see if you can plug in those values into your equation. Don't solve anything yet, but see if you can plug them into your equation. Here's the equation you should have gotten. 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 20t plus 6. Did we get that? Okay, so what's my A? Negative 16, B, and C. And then let's plug it in. So t equals negative B plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a.
So you're always going to be dividing by 32? Negative 32.
For these problems, yeah. So t equals negative 20 plus or minus, okay, so 20 squared is 400, right? And then negative 4 times negative 16 times 6 gives me a positive 384. Did you get that? Yeah. So 384 plus 400 is 784. So I did both of these steps in one. Are we okay with that? I squared that, multiplied, and added them together. All over negative 32. Okay, so let's see if you can use your calculator now. So I want you to get the 2 answers from your calculator. Okay, so the first one is negative 20 plus the square root of 784 divided by negative 32. You should have gotten negative 0.25, 0.25. Okay, so, yeah. And then we're going to do it again with the minus, so negative 20 minus the square root of 784 divided by negative 32. And you should have gotten a positive 1.5. The negative is not going to work for us. And it's 1.5 seconds. Now, it might not always be seconds, so make sure you go back and look at what the velocity is. Okay? All right, I would like you to try 3 and 4, 100%. So set up your equation, solve it, get your answer. You can work with your group, and then we'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, so those are your equations. For number 3, you should have negative 400 plus or minus the square root of 400 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 2400 all over 2 times negative 16. Are we still okay? Okay, so T equals negative 400 plus or minus the square root of 400 squared is 160,000. And then negative 4 times negative 16 times 2,400 is 153,600. Good thing you don't have to factor that, right? All over negative 32. So before you plug it into your calculator, you should have negative 400 plus or minus the square root of 313,600 all over negative 32. Okay. Do you need to see me plug it in?
No.
All right, so negative 400 plus the square root of all of that divided by negative 32. My first answer is T equals negative 5. Okay. And then negative 400 minus the square root of, okay. And then I get a positive 30.
Yep.
Do you have those two answers?
Yep.
So negative 5 we can't use, and it should be 30 seconds. Now, this particular problem, because they are both whole numbers, you could have factored it. You probably would have been able to pull out a GCF of negative 16 and simplified it a little bit. And then you could have factored if you wanted to. If you like the quadratic formula for these, then just stick with that. Okay? How'd I get what?
I made all of the final step. I got 9,000.
Uh-oh. I know I did this one wrong.
Oh, I know what you did. You didn't do that square root.
Did you take the square root, Gabriel?
No.
Okay. All right.
It's okay.
Number 4. You should have T equals negative 80 plus or minus the square root of 80 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 3.5 all over 2 times negative 16. So far, so good? I'm going to take silence as a yes. Negative 80 plus or minus. Now, 80 squared is 6,400. I'm just going to write that here so I can do it in one step. Negative 4 times negative 16 times 3.5 is 224 plus that 6,400. Underneath your square root, you should have 6,624. Is that what you have? Okay. All over negative 32. Then in your calculator, negative 80 plus the square root of 6,624 divided by negative 32. I get T equals negative 0.04. And then negative 80 minus the square root of 6,624 divided by negative 32. I get 5.04. Did you get both of those answers?
Yeah. No.
No. Do you have this?
No.
Do you have this?
Isn't that equation
Oh. Yeah. And then this one is also in seconds. Are there any questions?